Hello and welcome. India needs economic growth. In order to get that growth, India also needs a combination of education, skills, jobs, and all the stuff that put together will create a better future for all of us. But equally important in all of this is a strategy for urbanization, which India clearly lacks. Let's understand this a little more as we speak to Parag Khanna, professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. Parag, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
So, I know that your expertise spans many areas, but let's try and understand the growth story and the challenges that it faced from a few points. And one of them is urbanization and our inability to perhaps have framed a proper policy for urbanization or manage it.
Urbanization is key. It's been an organic driver of growth around the world. As you know, most of the world's population now lives in cities. That number is projected to rise to about 75% of the world's population living in cities by the year 2030. In China, 450 million people will be moving into cities in the next quarter century. In India, it's approximately 250 million people, right? So that's the current population of UP, for example, moving into cities. The issue is this, and it goes back to actually your initial comment just at the opening. You said growth depends on education and jobs and skills and so forth. Actually depends on infrastructure. That's the most important word. The single best correlation to long-term stable economic growth is infrastructure investment. Hands down. Of the many factors you could look at, it is infrastructure. Now, the countries in East Asia like China, Malaysia, Vietnam, that have grown the most steadily in the last 10, 15 years have also been those that have invested 10 to 15% of their budgets, and investment as a share of GDP has been over 25, 30%. And that has created mobility, allowed people to move around the country. It's created jobs, obviously, in infrastructure, construction, and so on. That has not happened in India. India's growth has happened, as you know, because of, in a way, this leapfrogging, right? It's a remarkable story to take services before industrial modernization and to use that to propel growth. But it has not been widespread. But coming back just to urbanization for now, a strategy on urbanization has to mean not only absorbing people into cities in a way that puts a roof over their heads and creates services for them and creates jobs in services for them, but also builds new cities. In China, they're planning on building literally up to 100 new cities in the next 20 years. In India, the most progressive plan has been the DMIC, right, the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor. That, of course, has had a very, very slow start. Land allocation issues, politics, funding, investment, and so on. And that, at its most ambitious, will build about 7 new cities. So again, the scale is not there, the political will is not there, the level of funding is not there. All of these things are necessary if you want to not just grow because of urbanization, but actually have a strategy to harness that growth.
Right. So, if let's park urbanization for a moment. Let's look at some of the other preconditions for economic growth and, for that matter, even social growth. What would they be, and to what extent are they being effectively looked at in India today?
This is where, of course, education and skills come in very strongly. Now, let's go back to the notion that the services economy has been the lead engine of growth in the country. As we all know, I don't think Indians need to be lectured anymore about the fact that only a couple of million people are directly employed in the BPO sector, in the IT, knowledge services, and so forth. Now, it has been remarkable. There are trickle effects to these technologies that come not only from outside of India, now within India. I think, again, it's remarkable. But as a driver of the basics, putting food on the table, so to speak, these bread and butter kinds of issues around jobs, and the large scale around the first tier, second, third tier cities of India, IT is obviously not going to be that engine when a population is this large. India and China are in the league of their own, right, demographically in terms of the size. So we have to really think about fundamental job creation kinds of things. So education is one, of course. There are some very interesting experiments in India. India might be the leader, in fact, in some of the experiments around cloud-based education, mobile education, village education. All of these things are wonderful. Now, India, again, has to scale them because the country is so large. So I certainly view that as very important. But infrastructure, construction, retail, these are actually the jobs of the past that are also, believe it or not, the jobs of the future. India is on the one hand quite futuristic in having an IT services sector that is propelling a whole, a good part of the economy. But it has to go back to those just fundamental nuts and bolts around construction, retail, services, the things that employ not thousands or a couple of million, but hundreds of millions of people, manufacturing and so on. And that's what India has to sort of discover a bit later than other Asian countries have.
So it's almost like a rediscovery rather than
Yes,
a discovery.
it's a discovery of the aspects of the traditional economic modernization paradigm that other countries have gone through, whether it's Korea, decades ago, or Malaysia and Vietnam in the last couple of decades, having to relive that, as you say, doing it later than those other countries, while in IT it's actually kept pace with them.
So is it more a mind, it's a way of thinking that, we all thought that we had leapfrogged, and in leapfrogging we had moved on to something else and left the past behind, so to speak.
There's we and there's we. There's the very small we of Indians that have driven this, and they've done it very well. But then there's the national we. And of course the political leadership can only be said to have generally abdicated the responsibility for about 1 billion people, right? And that's a problem. That's not the case in China, quite frankly. I travel to China very regularly. I think no one would say that they have abandoned the concerns of the everyday concerns of their citizens. So yes, there has to be political will. I don't actually like that term, but it's apt in this situation. But then it takes all elements of society, right? There is a thriving business community. They have to play a role. Private sector has to lead in some ways in the investment where there is a big shortfall in government spending. So I think there's a role for all elements of Indian society to make up this gap.
So does that mean in some ways also opening these areas for more foreign investment, retail being a case, in other areas there's no problem?
That's very tricky, because it's not clear that will necessarily create jobs. I'm someone who, I'm not a neoliberal, neoclassical economist. I look at the situation of a country and I say the cost-benefit analysis for a developing country should be what is in our best interest rather than what fits a global paradigm imported from the US, right? So India is rightly asking, well, if we allow a liberalization in X, Y, Z sectors, is it going to create efficiencies? Probably. Is it going to create jobs? Not necessarily. And I think that has to be weighed off on a case-by-case basis. But generally, the introduction of more competition would probably be a good thing in quite a few areas. But again, this doesn't have to be either or. Again, I would say that India's investment in infrastructure will strengthen the domestic private sector and improve its efficiency so that even if you did liberalize, Indian firms would be able to better compete and have efficient value chain or supply chains the way foreign companies tend to do. So these things are interrelated. It's not just a question of the FDI law. This also relates to the issues we were talking about earlier, like infrastructure.
Right. So let me come back. So you said that growth is something that we need, but the only way you can achieve it is through infrastructure. The only way it can be achieved is through a strategic view on urbanization, which we're clearly not. So while the answer may be apparent, but how do you view the dangers of not acting on that in a more accelerated way? We are, of course, acting on it, but not enough.
Well, India is living the dangers of not sufficiently acting on it. I mean, if you look at everything from the agricultural supply chain that lets food rot and people go hungry, to the lack of job creation in the manufacturing and in construction spaces that lead to a very large number of unemployed youth, what more evidence actually are you looking for that India has fallen behind in this area? I think it's actually quite a tragedy. So I think that India is living the slow growth effects. Now, and I just mentioned the slow growth. The volatility in India's growth, from a brick economy that Goldman Sachs and everyone celebrates because of its potential for 7, 8, 10% growth, dropping down to the 3%, 4% range. Why is that? Well, it's also because of the lack of infrastructure investment. Where you don't have the physical foundations for social and economic mobility, your growth will be very volatile. And India is indeed quite susceptible to capital account inflows and outflows and so forth. And that's why the central bank is scrambling to rescue the currency right now. So all of these things are indeed very, very interrelated.
Right. And how does this link to the larger market that's ASEAN and Southeast Asia, or East Asia for that matter? And can that be an opportunity?
It's a great question. I think India has had a geopolitical identity crisis, right? Is it a continental rival to China? Is it the maritime power straddling the Indian Ocean and the new Silk Road of commerce between the Middle East and the Far East, or both? I think it's more the latter. China borders more countries than any country in the world, and it has the ability to spread its tentacles of rail networks and other types of infrastructure to build influence in all of those countries, including around India, as you know, whether it's Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar. India cannot quite do that geopolitically. India should focus on its maritime strengths and its access and its cultural heritage and relationships with the countries of ASEAN. ASEAN, with 10 countries and 600 plus million people, has a larger GDP than India. And the gap is actually projected to widen between now and 2020. It represents a very young population, an urbanizing population, a mobile population, a more educated population, a tech-savvy population. The IT products, of course, that India develops should find growing market share in ASEAN. It is actually the fastest growing region in the entire world as a cluster of countries. And it's, of course, just across the Andaman Sea from here. You know, and I live in Singapore. I travel to Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand frequently. The dynamism is just amazing. So India could do a lot more with strategic government support as well, in addition to Indian corporates listing on those exchanges, forming joint ventures there, pushing their companies to have offices there. Now, it's a tremendous market for India. It represents one of several very high growth consumer retail types of markets, telecom, IT, including parts of Africa, where India needs to look much more aggressively. Yes, of course, there are Indian companies there. They're doing quite well.
Yeah.
Right? TCS has a big presence in Singapore, for example. But I'm talking about a huge order of magnitude more
geostrategic
presence.
push.
Absolutely. That's what it takes to actually change the economic equation in terms of the value of India's exports, the job creation derived in or emanating from these sectors, and ultimately India's sort of balance of payments and bottom line.
And that links also in some ways to the other aspect that you are quite keenly interested in, that's military affairs, right? And India's own kind of struggle with trying to portray itself as a strong and self-reliant power in this region.
And that story is, again, just very slowly, sort of painfully unfolding in the same way that this identity crisis I mentioned earlier was geographic. That also means it's, of course, geopolitical. So large investments in thinking about the role of the nuclear arsenal and the Air Force and so on, whereas in fact now it's shifting much more towards a focus on the Navy, which again I believe all along should have been more of the strategy, and thinking about those maritime relations with Africa, with the Middle East, and with ASEAN countries. That is what is emerging to be India's grand strategy. I think that's healthy and it's correct, but it will take quite a long time to execute on.
Right. So Parag, I think you've connected the dots quite well. So you said you travel to China a lot, and there's always interest in trying to understand what are the China examples that we can learn from, where we can learn from. So anything that you'd like to leave us with, which you think is a good or fascinating example of?
I mean, I probably haven't said infrastructure enough today, but I obviously have. It makes, of course, a tremendous amount of difference. Again, also the urbanization strategy, to reiterate that. But believe it or not, the focus of the new Chinese regime is indeed on the rural communities, right?
Yes.
They're shifting away from an emphasis on the coast and from export-led growth towards a modernization of infrastructure for rural populations, improving farmer productivity, reforming land rights, some of these absolute basic things, because their Gini coefficient, their income inequality is, the disparities, of course, just as bad as India, if not worse. Right? So, but they have now a concrete strategy, a 5-year, 10-year plan for addressing that. So that is, of course, something that we can learn. Now, India is trying to do this. You have the guaranteed minimum wage, sort of right to work, right to food. I think these are healthy pieces of legislation. But of course, in China, they're backed by actually trillions of dollars in investment.
So you're the first person who said that amongst the people I've spoken to, that these are healthy pieces of legislation.
Well, I mean, they're better than nothing. A few minutes ago I said that I find that this government has abdicated for decades its responsibility for its population. For a legislature to actually make it a law of the land and therefore obligate itself to address these issues can only be viewed as a step forward. If in its execution it winds up being as corrupt through the levels of administration that can be the case in India and has been the case, that of course would not be a good thing. But morally, I think it's hard to argue that it's not a good thing.
Right, Parag, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.